Good morning, afternoon and evening, ladies and gentlemen. Organizers, thank you for inviting me for this very interesting conference. I'm so glad to be able to give a keynote speech to you about sustainable consumption in times of COVID-19. Let me share my screen with you. Here we are. So I will quickly run you through the short history of consumption and consumerism, what we learned from sustainable consumption research, to end up in what can we do, systemic changes and policies. So COVID-19 changed everything, as we know. Global supply chains were disrupted, especially for medical supplies, but also for consumer goods. We saw large-scale behavioral changes, mainly because there was no quick technical fix in the form of a vaccine. A big gap opened up between essential and other workers. We saw the vulnerability of consumer society. You know, all these big changes in travel collapsing, employment plummeting, schools and recreational parks closed. And very interesting, we saw an enormous increase of the role of the state. So here is a massive social experiment. What would happen if we all decided not to consume? Helena Brown says, I never thought that I would see the day when the answer to the latter question materialized in all its dimensions. But here we are, staring at it during the COVID-19 crisis. So how did this all come about? As we all know, consumer society is a complex system: technology, culture, infrastructure, institutions, markets. It is basically the organizing principle of how we organize our social life. It is meant to satisfy everyday's needs and wants, signaling social position. It is it is expressed in cultural celebrations, etc., etc. Is it also a path to life satisfaction? And I will come later back to this complex system that is sketched on the right. So in terms of GDP, household consumption is about 70% of GDP in the US. So it is extremely important. So consumer society is not something that is accidental or is a natural law. It was purposefully created after 1945, together with the American dream of good life. So one of the reasons was that there was an enormous overcapacity of the war industry. It was redirected to consumer goods, but demand had to be created. And so the creation of suburbs and exurbs, which created a huge amount for consumer products, for car transportation, etc., was an answer to this challenge. And in the 1980s, this was further accelerated by the Chicago School of Supply Side Economics. So the American dream basically evolved enormously. In the war, there was scarcity and sparse living, and this is how people imagined it at that time, good living. And as we can see here, the idea of a dream house has evolved tremendously from a fairly modest standalone house in the 50s to this enormous castle in the 2010s. One person's dreams is another person's nightmare, as we all have to come to understand. And we're all part of it. We're all socialized into this consumerism. So even before Second World War, the consumption society has been invented by people like Edward Bernays, who was a cousin of a nephew of Sigmund Freud. He created modern marketing and advertisement. He developed a scientific technique of shaping and manipulating public opinion. The engineer of content is if you could tap into people's desire to feel good, powerful, and sexy, you can sell everything from toothpaste to cigarettes to cars and houses. We must shift America from a needs to desires culture. And Victor Lebeau, many decades later, added to it that our enormously productive economy demands that you make consumption our way of life, that you convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we need to seek our spiritual satisfaction and our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things to be consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced, and discarded at ever-increasing rate. This was 1955. And these are some of the early advertisements that appeal to people's hang for a good life through consumer products. So the sustainable consumption was first defined in 1995. It was very much inspired by Brundtland and from a life cycle perspective. A more updated definition was from the UNEP in 2016. We are looking at a flourishing life, but we're also looking at individual and collective decisions about aspirations, about how to satisfy needs and adopting practices. And we also see that there is an infrastructure and a context there, societal norms, political institutions, and public policies. So in all those years of research, what did we learn from sustainable consumption research? And I have to be very brief here, of course, because what can I say in such a short time? Consumption is a collective activity. It's embedded in the economy and culture, and it's reinforced by marketing. And it is, so consumption and economic growth are two sides of the same coin. We cannot have economic growth and not grow in consumption. The system also includes the culture of consumerism. The drivers include the advertising industry, which generate desires. And the result is a circular treadmill in people's lives. Want, work, earn, spend, consume, want. So let me quickly stop at the Diderot effect. So Diderot, as you know, got a new mantle and suddenly everything starts to look shabby. So basically he said, be careful what you want for. Maybe stick with the things that you have with your old friends, as he calls them. One of the important questions about sustainable consumption research is if consumption actually makes us happier. And there are many researches that touch on it. I can only touch very quickly on it. So here we see that increase in GDP did not increase the index in social health. And in this picture, and on the upper right side, you see the USA. We can see that health and social problems are more common. Health problems and social problems are more common in more unequal societies. USA here at the far top. So this is an example of keeping up with the Jones. I count my blessings, but then I end up counting those of others who have more and better blessings. And it pisses me off. So more lessons learned. So we have learned that technological advances can drive consumption by establishing new social practices, rituals and routines widely adopted by individuals and society. And that led to social practice theory that shows how consumption is intertwined with technology and culture. Change is not so easy. I mean, some people argue that it can be done at life-changing life events. Excuse me. Material consumption above a certain minimum had not led to greater well-being. And the ecological footprint is related to not the greenness of consumers, but their level of incomes, as you can see in this slide. I keep moving my picture around in order to show you the slides. So some impacts of unsustainable consumption and economic growth. As we all know, climate change, you can see it here. Loss of biodiversity, inequity and poverty, vulnerability for natural disasters like COVID, stress and unhappiness. Also growing recognition that consumption is a core driver of greenhouse gas emissions. So the Paris agreements recognized it in their preamble. They didn't had a lot of policies there. Pope Francis acknowledged it in his encyclical Laudato Si, and of course IPCC finally also mentioned consumption that should contribute up to 50% of reduction of CO2 levels. So carbon is everywhere in our consumption behavior, in our houses, heating and cooling, in our furniture, in what we buy, our driving habits, our foods, our transportation, and not only our consumption here, but also many of the products are produced somewhere else in China and transported to here, which leads to a lot of embedded energy. Most importantly, sustainable consumer society is a complex system, and changing complex system is notoriously difficult. So John Sterman, systems dynamics professor at MIT, tried to sketch out this complex system of consumption and consumerism, and I'm not going into this system. Technology alone cannot solve climate change. We need consumption. Technology, renewable energy, and electric cars is necessary but not sufficient. For reducing global poverty alone from $3 to $8 a day will consume already 16% of our 2 degrees carbon budget. And enormous investments in renewables and infrastructure actually require so much energy that it actually will boost fossil fuel. So in addition, we need big changes in lifestyles. And Square Global has formed a working group, and Square Brazil from this working group has created these 4 lifestyle scenarios that I will not go into it, but I refer you to the publication there. Basically, there are all these different scenarios of back to normal onto completely virtual lifestyles. So lifestyle changes, however, are not enough. We also need systemic change. We need to change economics. We need to get into degrowth and follow the recommendation of the degrowth movement. We need to curtail the financial system. We need to curtail individual consumption, and we need to communicate better the relationship between consumption and climate change. A huge agenda. So Kate Raworth is the founder of Donut Economics. And basically, in addition to ecological economics, she says, it's not only that economics has an outward ecological ceiling, but also has a social foundation. Below that, we don't have a social minimum. So in between is a pretty narrow, safe operating space for humanity. And that is the basis of her economic thinking. Moving from systemic change towards more mundane policies, you can think on a very high level about 3 different policies for 3 different income and wealth levels. For the middle class, universal basic services, shortening of the working week, carbon pricing of goods and services, etc. For the upper class, it's basically attacking their wealth tax, steep income tax, inheritance tax. And for low income groups, it is basically create a secure basis by creating jobs, low cost education, housing and care, financial safety net. And then of course there are other laws necessary to curtail multinational corporations, financial institutions, and a global trade regime. So finally, I come to the role of us, research and researchers. Not only it is about creating new data and new conceptual frameworks and theories, it's also about co-creating new knowledge through action research together with stakeholders. It is also more even about developing new knowledge about root causes and solution directions, and to develop policy options and communicate with policymakers. Try to influence decision-making and policies. And then finally, reflecting on our own roles as co-creators of knowledge, our roles as co-creators of knowledge, our roles as communicators and influencers. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I wish you a very fruitful conference. And please keep in mind that consumption is the key to sustainable development. Thank you very much.